Zach, I'm so utterly, wholeheartedly sorry. So, the Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice Ultimate Cut Edition is here. I've seen it, and considering the huge breadth of different reactions I've been seeing from people who love the theatrical cut, were indifferent toward it, or outright hated it, I figured I should at least see what my own reaction to the new product was. 30 additional minutes is more than enough to make two cuts of any film distinctly different movies, so even though I vehemently despised the movie in theaters, I felt I owed it to this new movie to look at it with fresh eyes. Importantly, the reason I call it a new movie is because in any story, context is key. People may argue that simply adding more on top of a weak story won't do that story any favors, but every scene in a movie matters when contextualizing every other scene, and what's a weakness in one context can be made a strength in another, vice versa. As you can probably already tell, I've gone from the camp that's totally fine lambasting Snyder for delivering an inferior product, to the camp that's face-palming at Warner Brothers for cutting the things that they did and holding them firmly responsible for my awful first impressions of the film. So clearly I like the Ultimate Cut more, but by how much? Gear up, folks, because this is going to be a long one, and in contrast to my other review, heavy on spoilers and a more in-depth look at specific scenes. For all the talk of this being a different movie, comparisons to my first viewing are inevitable, as I am experiencing much of this for a second time and naturally have to reevaluate things. There are the more superficial observations, of course. I praised the film for its visuals initially, and while I still think it looks good most of the time, there's a weird griminess to how characters look in certain scenes that I don't care for at all. I like the score even more on a second watch, and if this is Hans Zimmer's final superhero film score, it's a good note to end on. Of course, what I really care about is the story, and while I certainly found more of one here, there are still glaring issues that I'll readdress later, hopefully with more tact than I did in my last review. But that can wait, because right now I really do want to highlight some positives, starting with what's probably the biggest and most important one, which is that I can finally, wholeheartedly say I like this version of Clark Kent. Like, guys, that's a big deal. The biggest sin Warner Brothers committed in the hack job that was the theatrical cut was getting rid of so much of Clark's personal moments. My biggest issue with Clark on a first watch wasn't that he killed that one terrorist or that he makes a lot of stupid, boneheaded decisions in the third act, both of which are still problems that keep him low on my list of favorite incarnations of the character. No, my real big issue was that Clark seemed to cave way too easy to the cynicism of the world around him. He seemed really hopeless for a character the movie kept trying to convince me gave people hope. But the additions made in the D.O. Juice go a long way to helping me see why someone would look at this version of Clark and feel that hope. The most ironic thing about that is that all of the scenes I'm talking about are Clark out of costume. Clark's battle with cynicism seems way more like a struggle in this version, and the fact that he caves to it feels a bit more justified. Like a great moment that does involve him in costume, saving people after the Senate bombing and being passive-aggressively told to leave by a medic who's clearly scared of him. But it's in investigating the Batman as Clark Kent that he displays a determination and empathy that the theatrical cut was sorely lacking. The scene where he talks to the baby mama of the criminal that got shanked on account of his bat brand not only helps me see Clark in a better light, but highlights how good of an idea it was to use Batman's lack of empathy as a device to make Clark look better. Unfortunately, that still raises the question of why the Bat brand is enough to get a criminal killed in jail and whether that was Batman's intent in giving the brand, both of which the movie needs to elaborate on. That's a bit of a nitpick and not enough to ruin the moment, but I think it ties in with the general lack of information or follow-through all over the film, which, to varying degrees, undermines potentially cool story elements. In defense of the theatrical cut, I will say this. There are tiny details in certain scenes, particularly the first act, that were there in the first viewing but stuck out to me more on a second. For instance, I like the scene with the frightened cop in Gotham who nearly shoots his partner. His partner tells him that he should try not to shoot the good guys in his panic at seeing Batman for the first time. That exchange is basically a microcosm of Batman's own conflict, where he nearly kills a good guy because he's acting rashly out of fear. I also appreciate the scene where Clark first sees the girl on the news who's trapped in the burning building more. The way Cavill plays him as laser-focused on following Bruce until an innocent in trouble catches his eye, and from that second on it has his full attention. There are little things like that all over the movie that are interesting ideas that would have made for a truly great piece had the movie done anything with them. Perry White telling Clark that he doesn't get to decide what the right thing is, Superman renouncing his American citizenship, the idea Lex presents that power and innocence are mutually incompatible. I like the idea that maybe there's some of Zod's consciousness still inside Doomsday, as evidenced when he stops in front of Superman's statue and takes it in. How much is Doomsday a brainless monster, and how much is he actually Zod back from the dead? Of course, the Ultimate Cut adds its own little details that enhance the story, and at least make it a story. I like the one woman in Gotham City who displays a belief in the inherent goodness of both Batman and Superman. I think when you've got this kind of conflict and an audience who ideally likes both characters, it's important to have at least one person in the movie pose the idea that the two are both worthy of support and can reach a synthesis. I like all these things, I just wish we'd done more with them. So often I'm just being presented with an interesting concept that doesn't go farther than an implication, and that's fine, but only in small doses. Most of these things went completely over my head the first time I watched, and I feel like that wouldn't have been the case had they been more than tidbits. Even the ideas that are more fully realized have things working against them. After the Senate bombing, there's an exchange between Lois and Clark that I like, where Lois says that the Superman symbol means something, and Clark responds that it meant something on his world, but his world doesn't exist anymore. You could take this literally, like I initially did, and assume he's talking about Krypton, or you could take it symbolically with his world being the idealized Earth that he assumed he was protecting, the same one Perry White berated him earlier for believing in. By the end of the film, when Clark tells Lois that she is his world, you could take that to mean that Lois, who believes in Clark's ideals even more strongly than he does, and just selflessly risked her own life for the sake of stopping Doomsday, is all the evidence he needs that the world he saw earlier truly does exist and that there's a place for his mindset to thrive. This is bolstered by the scene where Clark talks to Jonathan, but I actually think this scene works against this thread, since Jonathan refers to Martha as the one who restored his faith in people, even though from what we're shown, Martha parrots the same cynical, objectivist, put-yourself-ahead-of-the-world mindset that Jonathan held in Man of Steel, a belief that Lois emphatically does not share. Even worse, there's still the issue that Lois doesn't have a reason to know that going back for the Kryptonite Spear is necessary, so her one actual thematic purpose requires a glaring contrivance in order to work. Now it's really time for me to stop being nice for a second, because if Superman is the half of this equation that sort of works now, Batman is the half that doesn't. At all. Even in the Ultimate Cut, nothing about Batman's characterization in this film holds up, which more than anything else now makes me nervous that he's going to get far more time and focus in Justice League than Clark is. A lot of my problem with the theatrical cut is that I found Bruce's quote-unquote arc lacking, and even worse, I had trouble finding him sympathetic past the opening sequence because his willingness to murder everyone he fought felt like it was lacking some serious context. Unfortunately, the Ultimate Cut doesn't really fix that problem, but it's been suggested by some that it's best to look at Batman as more like a villain than a hero for much of the story. A bad guy who goes through a redemption arc as opposed to someone the audience is meant to root for as he's doing what he's doing. I find it easier to buy that interpretation in the Ultimate Cut because in comparison, the theatrical version was practically all Bruce's perspective. Here, there's a way more healthy balance of Bruce stuff and Clark stuff, and I can more readily accept Clark as the true main hero of the film, and the one whose side I'm meant to be on the entire time. Unfortunately, though I can argue it was pulled off efficiently, I think that demonizing Bruce to lift Clark up is cheapening the argument a bit. I said this on my initial viewing, and it hasn't changed. The Batman of this film is a psychopath. He's seriously unhinged, and the issue is I could be so easily made to not find him unhinged if the movie wasn't still withholding information from me. Alfred acts like Bruce branding people is a big deal when he's been killing people or causing them to be killed for who knows how long. The stigma of the Bat brand as something that will get you shanked in prison has been around long enough that practically everyone knows what it means. I will grant the Ultimate Edition that we do find out later that Lex is paying prisoners to kill others who have the Bat brand on them, but apparently this has been going on for months and we still don't know what Bruce's thoughts on this process are. Putting aside why he places the brand in the first place, something that we still don't know, is he aware of what it means to other people by now? And if so, does he do it with the intent that they get killed in prison? Is that why Alfred is treating it as a bigger deal than just gunning down folks? If so, then it becomes a bit hard to relate to the lady I mentioned earlier who supports both Clark and Bruce. She says the only people scared of Batman are those who have reason to be, but does that just mean anyone who's committed any crime? The man who got branded was taking part in human trafficking, but we don't know what his role in the operation was, and allegedly he was a good father to his child even if he wasn't married. So how far does a criminal have to go, even if they aren't totally irredeemable, before Batman decides their life is forfeit anyway? Again, assuming that's a decision Bruce is making consciously. I can't take it as a given that that's the case, because when he's about to brand Lex toward the end of the movie, he says, "Wherever you go, whatever you do, I will be watching you." So clearly he doesn't expect Lex to die. So again, what purpose does the brand serve? What does Bruce think he's accomplishing when he does it? This is something that we need to know and the movie never tells us. If Bruce doesn't know what his brand causes by now, then is he just not paying attention? Is he an idiot? Is he a crazy person? Oh wait. There are just so many questions here that, without answers, make it seem like Bruce doesn't care one iota for the consequences of his actions, and it makes it impossible for me to root for him when he does anything because I can't be sure what he's thinking or where he's coming from. When he's using the Batmobile to chase down Lex's goons for the kryptonite sample, there's no way Bruce knows that his little grappling hook trick is going to have the effect it does once he makes that decision. It's impractical and unnecessary, and the movie is just having him do it because it looks cool. It's especially egregious because said cool factor is still the only reason that chase sequence is there to begin with. Bruce does a lot of impractical things when fighting both criminals and Superman, especially the latter. He takes time out to humiliate him, talk him down, and cut him on the cheek, and that combined with the occasional smile he has goes a long way to making me think of him as just loving the violence for the sake of violence, even at the expense of the smarter option to stab him with the kryptonite spear as an opening move. Bruce initiates the fight with Clark in order to get rid of what he thinks is a threat to the world, but he draws the fight out for the sole purpose of dehumanizing a man and making him suffer. But again, let's pretend that we're supposed to look at Bruce as an antagonist for 90% of this movie. The fact that I call him a psychopath isn't just because he's wrong and doing things for the wrong reasons, it's because he's actually crazy. Because the Ultimate Cut makes Clark more sympathetic to me personally, I as an audience member am more inclined to ask yet again why Bruce doesn't give Superman the benefit of the doubt. Yes, the destruction of Metropolis was Superman's fault and incredibly irresponsible, and Bruce has every right to be bitter about it. But he should understand what the concept of collateral damage is, and he spends 18 months looking for a way to kill the dude. But again, we can excuse this as Bruce having a lack of perspective because he hasn't completed his arc. What makes this a true problem is the fact that the third act of this movie crumbles that arc into a million pieces through its execution. I'm not going to spend a million years talking about the Martha scene. The one true problem with that scene is that it's contrived and it has no logical reason to take place the way it does. Clark has no reason to refer to his mother by first name, and his decision to only say this now makes him look dumb and stupid and dumb. What makes it a scene that breaks the film rather than just a bad contrived scene is the follow-up. The reason the Martha scene happens is so that Bruce can regain his empathy. We're supposed to see this as the end of a transitional arc where he realizes that his perspective is out of whack and that he's dehumanizing not just Superman but everyone he fights. First of all, no, the execution does not do that sentiment any justice. If we're meant to take away from this that just recognizing that Clark has a mother is enough to make Batman empathize with him and see him as human, then why did we just give Bruce a line implying he sees Clark having parents as a given and was going to kill him anyway? The scene isn't helped by the visual direction either. The fact that we cut away to flashbacks of Martha Wayne's name being spoken or shown goes a long way to telling me as an audience member that the name is all Bruce is focusing on and all he cares about. I can't look at this scene and confidently say that if Clark hadn't gotten lucky and his mom had any other name in the world, then Bruce wouldn't have gone ahead and killed him right there. And because of that, I'm totally distanced from Bruce in this crucial character-defining moment, and I'm still just looking at him as a crazy sack of crazy. Secondly, the entire rest of the film only goes to show that Bruce's perspective hasn't changed at all. He's still killing and brutalizing people that he really doesn't have to in order to get the job done. So clearly he hasn't actually grown more empathetic, he's just more partial to Clark in particular now. He's learned that he was wrong about Superman, but not why he was wrong about Superman. And the biggest point of evidence to this non-change is the fact that he's still putting stock in what was clearly a dream by the end of the film. Bruce's only reason for wanting to see the Justice League assembled by the end of the movie is something that he should logically look upon as a dream. Since both the apocalyptic future with Clark as its fascist leader and the message from the Flash are both events that he wakes up from. Because Bruce wants the Justice League, it's clear that he was taking those visions seriously when he experienced them, and so we can infer that the earlier half was motivation for him wanting to further stop Clark. And yet he has absolutely no reason to think of them as visions of the future, especially after he and Clark make up and Clark becoming the evil dictator of the world seems like an utter impossibility. If he can't take stock in evil Clark, or by extension Flash's line about fearing him, then why is he taking stock in anything else that happened? For that matter, this just draws attention to the counterintuitive choice the film makes to give Bruce more than just that dream sequence. If Bruce is taking this quote-unquote vision seriously, does that mean he also believes that a giant man-bat burst out of his parents' grave, or that those bats really did raise him into the air as a child? If Bruce believes anything that Flash said, then does he believe that Clark is going to come back from the grave as an evil dictator? Because that's the only way this has any consistency. Bruce has no reason to believe that these two scenes meant anything unless he's just a crazy person. A crazy person who's thinking about things the exact same way he is at the end of the film as he was at the beginning. Now, because of the Justice League set visit, we all know that Bruce is going to be characterized differently in that film than he was in this one. And I'm all for that on the level of seeing this character done better, but on the level of that as a natural progression from the events of this film, I just don't buy it. There's no way that I can give credence to the idea that Bruce after the climax of this movie is somehow a changed person. And you know what? I blame Bruce for this movie having what's probably the worst Jon Stewart episode ever in it. Come on, Jon, you're talking about Superman. Bring your A material. A lot of issues from the theatrical cut are still there outside of the botching of Batman, and unfortunately, like the theatrical cut, my problems really start to emerge almost immediately after the first act. The peach tea, the unnecessary and wasteful deaths of Jimmy Olsen and Mercy Graves, the lack of any input from Superman in his own public discourse, etc. Outside of screwing over Batman's character, the dream sequence and the Justice League setup is still pointless and drags the story to a complete halt. Wonder Woman has no purpose and isn't really a character. The idea that Clark believes he's only been Superman to appease Pa Kent's beliefs, righting wrongs for a ghost as he calls it, still doesn't make any sense. Even though the Ultimate Cut sets up that Clark sees Batman as unresponsive to diplomacy, the idea that he doesn't take the multitude of opportunities he has during their fight to just tell Bruce what's going on still makes Clark look stupid. Bruce's Rocky-style training montage still accomplishes nothing. The idea that Clark defeating Doomsday in yet another city-destroying brawl is enough to put a torn public firmly back on his side to the point that they close down the city to mourn him just because he sacrificed himself in the process doesn't work at all for me. And perhaps biggest of all, for as much as I like the thematic purpose Lois serves relative to Clark, her entire subplot of identifying Luthor as the man responsible for everything is still just a bunch of padding that's there mainly to give her screen time and something to do outside of being Clark's sounding board. If anything in this movie should have been cut for the sake of time, I would have gone with almost all of the Lois scenes. I will at least give Warners that I think they were right to cut the scenes where she realizes that Wallace Keefe wasn't responsible for anything because he'd brought fresh groceries, yeah, really, and also the scene where he realizes that the reason Clark couldn't see the bomb in his chair is because it was lined with lead. Since, Superman not being able to see through lead isn't something we've established in this continuity yet. Although I was in the minority in that I found Lex easily the least offensive part of the film on a first viewing, looking at it a second time, the character really stopped working as the movie went along. For starters, Eisenberg's performance really does take me out of it. Sorry, Jesse. Secondly, while I feel like I had a better grasp of his motivations than most people who watch the movie on a first view, looking back at what he actually says in the film leaves me thinking they were trying to do way too much with him ideologically, and it all came out as a mess. The problem isn't, as others have stated, that Lex has no reason to want Superman dead, but that he has a huge plethora of disparate reasons that never come to make a whole. In one scene, it's implied his issue with Clark is that he has power without knowledge, which we can extrapolate as having power without having earned it, without having worked his way up to it like Lex's father did. In another moment, though, it's clear that he hates God figures on the whole because he was embittered when no God came to save him from his father's child abuse. He insists that what makes God figures corrupt is that they pick sides, pick favorites, and implies that Clark is guilty through inaction. Yet with Superman being the first and only God figure of actual flesh and blood, it seems like a big leap that Lex wouldn't adjust his reasoning now that he's not just being bitter toward a theory. Like, if Lex is out to prove that Clark is no better than any other man because he's fallible and biased, he really didn't need to go through all this trouble just to get that done. He certainly didn't need to make Batman a factor. If Lex's intent was to prove that Clark was willing to kill for the sake of his mother's life, again, picking a side, did Lex intend to let Clark's identity and the fact that Martha's life was on the line go public? There's just too many holes. Later still, Lex says that Clark's sin is simply existing, and at this point I have to wonder what I'm supposed to be taking away as Lex's big get from all this. Does he want Clark discredited or just gone? The more I think about it, the more Lex reminds me of Whiplash in Iron Man 2. Like, they're almost exactly the same. They hate the hero for being, in their eyes, a disingenuous god figure, and so they stage events to bring them down in the eyes of the public. They succeed at what they wanted to do relatively early in the story, and yet they're still in the movie, this time with the intent to kill the hero just so we can have more action scenes, even though by all rights they should see their work is already done. There's just too much going on with Lex and why he wants what he does, and I don't think the movie has a decent handle on it. Although I like Clark more in the Ultimate Cut, he doesn't get off scot-free either. I mentioned that I liked the little thread between he and Lois and considering her his world earlier, but what I still don't care for even on a second viewing is the no one stays good in this world line, after he's put into a corner by Lex to kill Batman. For starters, I still hate the fact that I have to convince him to help me or he has to die is a line coming out of Superman's mouth, especially when, as the whole world has pointed out by now, he has other options and by all rights should be able to save Martha on his own. He seemed willing to do just that after his fight with Batman, so why not before? Forgoing my personal moral feelings about it though, I just don't understand where this sentiment is coming from in this moment. Is he implying that because Luthor proved to himself, if no one else, that Clark does have a bias, that he's no longer good? Is Clark admitting that saving his mother's life by any means necessary isn't the right thing to do, but that he'll do it anyway because he's selfish and cares more about her than another life? Is he admitting, like Perry and Senator Finch suggested, that there is no definitive right and that everyone will be forced by life to choose between the lesser of two evils with every decision? The Pa Kent scene supports the latter, but the movie doesn't provide a straight answer, and I think it needs to for the sake of contextualizing such a questionable line. I want to believe that the idea of bias is the movie's coda, since it comes up early on with the terrorist leader, the idea that no one is neutral, but the connective tissue just isn't there. Like most of what was done with Bruce, it feels like the movie is stretching to give Clark a character-based reason to want to go to fisticuffs, and since we're there, I figure I might as well take the time to give a solid opinion on the movie's titular smackdown. The actual Batman v Superman fight is lame, I think. It's slow, it's undermined by the stupid character decisions that perpetuate it, and I honestly just don't think the choreography is all that impressive. Although, being nice, I think that putting a fair fight between Batman and Superman on film is something that's almost impossible to make look impressive. The fact is that unless he's severely depowered, then Superman crushes Batman like a bug in an instant. And once he is severely depowered, then what's the point? Although, I honestly think the easiest way to fix this would be to take the characters out of such close proximity with each other. Don't just make it a slugfest with two dudes punching and kicking each other and occasionally shooting kryptonite bullets for the sake of keeping the fight fair. Have Batman use some other projectiles and tools at range, and maybe have Superman try to keep his distance as well, since without his physical strength to rely on, he could maybe make use of some creative usage of heat vision or maybe even freeze breath. But that's me rewriting the movie, and I really don't need to do that a second time. Suffice it to say, I don't think that the spectacle of the fight is nearly grand enough to justify writing the entire movie around it. On top of that, while I brought up that the Ultimate Cut added to the list of little things that I like, it's important to point out that some of the small additions also didn't do anything for me, mainly by not contributing anything. For instance, the two cops watching the Gotham Metropolis football match, or later on in the film when Clark passes the old man and his son in the mountains. The old man says he has come here to die, referring to Clark, because he knows the mountain is impassable. We as viewers know that can't possibly be true, or at least that it's totally futile effort even if it is true, and so the exchange, like the rest of Clark's self-imposed exile, doesn't amount to much. For that matter, Clark outright hallucinating Pa Kent, either that or talking to his literal ghost, is still ridiculous. Also, there's the much-hyped Jenna Malone role, which amounts to basically nothing. As a final note, because not all of the scenes that were added in feel necessary, on top of the theatrical scenes that could have been left behind, the movie really feels its length, so be prepared for a long sit. All in all, despite the fact that a lot of this video is still me ragging on it, Batman v Superman The Ultimate Cut is a much better viewing experience than its theatrical counterpart. It's still got a huge amount of flaws, and I'm not entirely comfortable calling it a good movie. It's a decent Superman story with some really interesting ideas trapped inside of an awful, incompetently told Batman story. But that decent Superman story is still there, and it's enjoyable in broad strokes in a way that I don't think it was before. It goes a long way to show just how much the main character can make or break a piece, since this extended cut definitely feels like more of a Superman movie than a Batman movie, and almost every substantial improvement comes from the character of Superman. And really, it also goes to show just how effective a semi-well-done Superman can be, because even now as I admit that this is still a horribly flawed, non-functioning story that's being told, I will willingly sit down and watch this movie again of my own volition just so that I can enjoy the parts that I enjoyed on this viewing. That's a huge leap from where I was after seeing it the first time. I guess the simplest way to put it is this. The Ultimate Cut takes this movie from a complete train wreck the whole way through to a movie that's only really questionable and dumb for most of its running time and only becomes a complete train wreck in the third act. I know that sounds like a pretty heavy condemnation, and it is, but you know what? It just gives me a smidgen, just 2% more confidence that maybe there are actually some working brains over on the creative side of these films. And that maybe, just maybe, DC can improve. Maybe they can rebuild. Maybe they can be better. I cannot believe I'm saying this, but I just watched Batman v Superman and I came out of it with a bit of hope.